A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to have you with us again today. On the program here in just a couple of moments, we're going to talk with Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas, who is also running for Congress in Virginia's 7th Congressional District. We're going to be talking about the Second Amendment sanctuary movement. What else, of course? Another busy night across the state of Virginia. 5 more counties adopting Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions. 1 town becoming a Second Amendment sanctuary as well. I was in Prince Edward County, Farmville, Virginia, where we do Bearing Arms, Cam and Company each and every day. So I'll talk a little bit about that after our interview with Nick Freitas. I'm also going to be, if you happen to catch this right when this show gets posted up to YouTube, I'm going back tonight to Amelia County. And Amelia County was the very first county that I went to about a month ago when I heard that there was going to be a bunch of folks out there urging supervisors to consider a Second Amendment sanctuary resolution. I mean, they weren't voted on anything. That vote happens tonight. And when I showed up in Amelia County, which is a small town in central Virginia, it's kind of off the beaten path, there were hundreds of folks who were outside in the courthouse square because they couldn't fit inside that building where the supervisors were meeting. And it was that moment very early on that I realized, okay, if this is happening in Amelia County, there's no reason why it can't happen in every county in Virginia. And it hasn't happened everywhere. Well, actually, no, I take that back. We've seen huge crowds everywhere, even in these counties that have rejected Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions. But since that night a month ago, the movement really has swept across the state. And so I'm going back to Amelia County, where it all began for me in Virginia a month ago, and we'll have a full report on tomorrow's Bearing Arms, Cam and Company, and at bearingarms.com. But I did want to speak with Delegate Nick Freitas about the upcoming legislative session, about the Second Amendment sanctuary movement, what he thinks about the calls to bring out the National Guard to enforce these gun control laws. It was a great conversation with the delegate. Take a look and a listen. Delegate Nick Freitas, thank you so much for coming on Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. It's good talking with you today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Cam.
I know that you've been out to at least one of these Second Amendment sanctuary resolution meetings. You were there in Spotsylvania County. What was your reaction when you showed up and you saw the crowd on hand there?
I've been to several now, and I'll tell you what, it's incredibly encouraging to see this many people coming out to local board of supervisors meetings in order to, protest in favor of their Second Amendment rights. Again, when you look at what happened in Virginia and the situation that we're in right now, we lost the General Assembly by less than 5,000 votes across some of these strategic districts. And so I think a lot of people, didn't realize what was coming, but they do realize it now. And now it's all about channeling that energy in a positive way to make sure that we're defending our Second Amendment rights.
So what do you make of the movement, which has now grown as of Wednesday morning to 101 communities across the state? Are you encouraged? Do you think that it could make a difference when lawmakers convene in Richmond next month?
Well, look, I think a lot of the Democrats are very determined to push this legislation through. For the longest time, whenever we said that, look, Democrats want to take your guns, the Democrats would come back and say that's ridiculous, that's hyperbole, that's fear-mongering, nobody wants to take your guns. And then the moment they took control of the General Assembly, that's exactly what they did. And I think there were some people out there that, took the Democrats at their word that they weren't going to drop this kind of extreme left-wing anti-gun bills, but nobody's fooled anymore. And nobody believes that this is where it's going to stop. We know that they're going to try to do even more than what they're currently suggesting. And if you look at the speed with which this organization, with which this movement gathered steam, was organized, and actually had incredibly positive effects all over the Commonwealth, I think you're seeing something that it's not going away. That sort of energy is, and we're tapping into it. We're making sure that the people who are now getting involved for the first time are getting involved with organizations that are there to not only protect their Second Amendment rights, but to protect all of their civil rights.
Absolutely.
And so I think the Democrats have awaken a sleeping giant at this point.
I think that you're right. What do you make about, the reaction from Democrats like Governor Northam, Attorney General Mark Herring, who basically say, listen, there will be compliance with the law. These counties cannot avoid enforcing, all of these new gun control bills that are coming our way. We have the Dillon rule in Virginia that, basically precludes local governments from setting their own laws. Do you think that these counties can avoid enforcement of any unconstitutional gun laws that might be passed by the legislature?
Well, I find it fascinating that the same people that think it's perfectly appropriate for localities to, fail to cooperate with ICE when somebody has, when somebody that is in the country illegally has broken an additional law, has hurt somebody or has stolen from somebody or whatever it is, they think it's perfectly appropriate for localities to not comply with that law. But when it comes to actually depriving their own citizens of civil liberties and constitutionally protected rights, well, then they demand that localities take action and actively engage in what I believe is unconstitutional behavior. So, this is the typical intellectual dishonesty that we see coming from the extreme left, and it's no different here. I think what you're going to see at the local level, and you see this with sheriffs, I'm very proud of my own sheriff, Scott Jenkins in Culpeper County, and others who have essentially stood up and said, look, we're not going to enforce unconstitutional laws. The oath we swore was to the Constitution. Many of the laws that they're trying to pass in Virginia right now, I think, are constitutionally dubious at best and unconstitutional at worst. And I think the thing that we also need to take into consideration here is that we've always understood that localities and local law enforcement do have some discretion with respect to how they enforce the law. And so I don't think these localities, and I certainly don't think these sheriffs, want to divert resources away from finding violent criminals or solving a rape case so that they can go kick in the door of an otherwise law-abiding and peaceful citizen and confiscate their legally acquired property. And I think that's all these localities are saying, is that in the end, we're not going to divert much-needed resources away from actual crimes, violent criminals, in order to come after our own citizens because, a firearm that they purchased legally last year is now illegal because the Democrats think it looks scary.
Absolutely.
And I think, and so no, I do think the constitutional officers have the ability to use that kind of discretion, and I certainly encourage them to do so.
I'm glad to hear that. I find it interesting. We've got a couple of Commonwealth's attorneys in the Virginia Beach area that have said this year that they don't plan on, or actually came out and said, I'm not going to enforce, misdemeanor marijuana cases. You bring those to my office, I'm going to dismiss them. And we didn't hear anything from the Attorney General about consequences for those Commonwealth's attorneys. Governor Northam didn't chide these attorneys for ignoring portions of the state law that they disagree with. I mean, it seems to me, if you want to look at it that way, that the Democrats have sort of written the playbook for Second Amendment supporters to follow right now.
Oh, they absolutely have. And now that it's coming back to bite them on something that they don't like, they want to change the rules again. But that's typical. There's nothing unusual about that. I find it fascinating that our own resident socialist in the Virginia General Assembly, Lee Carter, has drafted a bill which essentially will punish law enforcement or remove them from their positions for not enforcing state laws. Well, here's my question to Delegate Carter, since he apparently doesn't understand unintended consequences. Does that mean every state trooper or every deputy sheriff that doesn't pull you over for going 56 and a 55 is now going to lose their job? And see, these are the sort of things they do not think about when they write their bills. Dick Saslaw's bill, SB 16, not only creates a horrible situation with respect to AR-15s, but one of his other bills creates a scenario to where if my 17-year-old daughter picks up a firearm in our house because she's home alone and somebody is breaking through the front door and she picks up a gun to defend herself, is she now a criminal? Am I a criminal? Because according to Dick Saslaw, if a minor touches a firearm unsupervised by an adult, that's now a crime. So they never think about the unintended consequences. They pass these far-reaching laws, and again, I think it's perfectly appropriate for Commonwealth attorneys and sheriffs to say, this is ridiculous, and we're not going to divert resources away from actual crime to go after made-up ones.
I'm glad to hear you mentioned that Saslaw bill, because I actually brought that up to my local supervisors when we had our county meeting, because, I live in a rural county as well. There are lots of folks who can't rely on a quick police response because we simply don't have the manpower to get to a priority one call in 5 or 6 minutes. I know families who have trained their kids from a very early age to be safe and responsible around firearms, but as you say, they'd be criminalized if they let their daughter have access to a gun for self-defense while she was home alone, or a 16 or 17-year-old hunting on their own property or their family's property. Now, are mom and dad going to be criminalized for that? It's absolutely unbelievable. But Again, this is the type of stuff that we're seeing. I want to ask you one more question real quick about Senate Bill 16. That's the so-called assault weapons ban that's been introduced by Senator Saslaw. There is no grandfather clause provision in there. If you currently own these firearms that are banned, you would not be allowed to continue to possess them. Governor Northam says, well, we're going to introduce a grandfather clause. A, does that make it something that you could vote for, delegate? And B, how confident are you that that legislators in the General Assembly would actually agree to a grandfather clause, given the sort of Beto O'Rourke standard is now ban them and take them?
No, absolutely not. I would never support that legislation for the reason you just mentioned. I think all of us understand that even if they got the assault weapons ban, it's not like the Democrats are going to go home and say, okay, we've done it. We've ended gun violence. They'll just come back a year later trying to ban something else, because when the policies that they are pushing forward don't actually produce the results that they promised their constituents, they never go back and introspectively decide, gosh, maybe this approach isn't the right one. No, they always come back with new ways to infringe on your Second Amendment rights. And let's be very clear with the compromise, the so-called compromise that Governor Northam is asking for. He's essentially saying, we'll do a grandfather clause, but you have to register your guns. Well, I always ask people this simple question. Go show me a country that has started to register guns that didn't lead to confiscation. Show me one. Because that's what happened in Australia, it's what happened in England, it's what's happened in Canada. Every time the government says, hey, we'll let you keep them, we just want you to register them, it's because they're planning to take them in the future. And the moment anybody says that's hyperbolic or that we're being extreme, just remember the same Democrats that told you for the last 2 years nobody wanted to take your guns, they just wanted common sense gun control measures. The moment they got a majority, what did they do? They started passing gun confiscation bills. So one of the reasons why we can't have an honest discussion about any of this is because the Democrats have demonstrated over and over again they are lying when they say they don't want to take the guns. Maybe some of them don't, but it's certainly not where Democratic leadership is. They want to take them, and they will pass legislation to do so.
Speaking of legislation, are Republicans going to offer up alternatives, things that are constitutional, are workable, and are effective at reducing gang violence, at combating domestic violence, at increasing safety, so that these types of active shooter attacks, like the one that we saw in Virginia Beach earlier this year, are less likely to take place? I mean, we're seeing this grassroots organic response locally to the gun control laws that have been introduced, but will Republicans be offering up workable alternatives that actually will address the subject rather than going after legal law-abiding gun owners?
Well, and part of the problem whenever we get into this discussion is you see the left talk a lot about gun violence. Mm-hmm. Whereas as Republicans, we're looking at, well, no, we want to stop any unlawful violence. And so that's where we put our focus. We put our focus on actually looking at the conditions which we believe contribute to environments where violence is more probable to take place. And we try to identify people that are more violent because they've been guilty of violent crime. And we make sure that those guys don't have possession of any sort of means that they can use to hurt their fellow citizens. And sometimes incarceration is required to make sure that they can't hurt their fellow citizens. But every time we do that, the Democrats want to come back and fight us on it. They don't seem to want to help us actually keep violent people away from peaceful law-abiding citizens, but they do want to disarm peaceful law-abiding citizens. And so I actually have a bill that I've had drafted up that specifically addresses what happened in Virginia Beach, because in that situation, we had a government employee that actually told her supervisor that she was worried about the very person that ended up coming in later and shooting some of his colleagues. And I think that when someone like that says, look, I have a concern about this person, and they've notified their supervisor, and the supervisor or the agency doesn't take any positive action in order to ensure that person's safety, well, then they should be held civilly liable if they're going to tell that person that they're not allowed to protect themselves. And so I think we need to get government to understand that if you are going to assume personal responsibility, if you're going to assume responsibility for the citizen's safety, and in doing so, you're going to deny them their right to defend themselves, well, then yes, you make yourself civilly liable in that process. And then I think Todd Gilbert's got some legislation we're looking at as well that I think really has worked well in some other areas where you've seen high degrees of violent crime and activity. And working with law enforcement, working with education in order to, one, identify circumstances where we might be able to intervene before a violent crime takes place. Mm. But two, when a violent crime does take place, that person needs to be separated from the people and the communities that they've harmed. And so we'll continue to look at solutions that we think properly address the issue of violence rather than just disarming law-abiding citizens who may very well need a firearm to be able to defend themselves and their families.
Absolutely. All right. Final question for you. I saw you do a video talking about the lobby day at the Capitol, January 20th, advising folks on where to park, take buses. We've got some buses coming from the Farmville area. I'll be speaking there at the rally. Hope to see you there. But what would it mean to have a huge turnout of gun owners from across the state there at the state Capitol on January 20th?
Well, the bottom line is there are, I would say, anywhere from 5 to 10 legislators between the House and the Senate and the Democratic Party who are, I think, a little bit more uncomfortable with some of these gun bills that are being proposed. And to see a huge crowd to show up, to see 5, 10, 20,000 people show up, this is a line you should not cross. This is a violation of our civil liberties. I think it could really have an impact on some of this legislation and maybe getting it killed. But the other thing that it also does is it allows people to network. And that's been one of the things that's been really missing in Virginia for those of us that care about not just the Second Amendment, but all of our Bill of Rights, is having the network of people who know each other, who have worked together, who have shared interests, that can actually communicate and effectively work in the future to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where you have an extreme element of the Democratic Party running essentially the entire state at this point and threatening essential civil liberties. So, if nothing else, the getting together, the talking with one another, the building those connections, the sharing of the contact information so that we can be more effective in the future is going to be critical, because I do believe there's going to be an electoral backlash for what the Democrats are doing. But the only way that's going to happen is if we actually get people working together, not just sitting home at Facebook and putting up an angry post. It's going to take more than that. And I think this rally on January 20th is one way for people to demonstrate that they're serious about it, they want to get plugged in, and they want to fight to protect their Second Amendment rights.
All right, last question for you, Delegate. We've heard from folks like Representative Donald McEachin that Governor Northam should call out the National Guard to try to enforce his gun control laws. I think that would be a horrible mistake if the governor took his advice. But we've seen a lot of bad decisions coming out of the governor's office and the attorney general's office. How concerned are you that they're going to double down and keep doubling down on these bad decisions and really, fracturing that relationship between the rural parts of the state and the suburban and urban parts of Virginia?
I think, I saw a constituent sent out an email to the entire House of Delegates and the entire Senate, and a Democrat, and basically talking about, is it true that they'll call up the National Guard? Is this something you would actually do? And a Democrat senator responded by saying, well, that's ridiculous. I wish you would vet this stuff before you would put it out. I don't know where you're getting this nonsense. Well, he's getting this nonsense from Democrat Donald McEachin, former member of the Virginia Senate and now member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And again, remember, these are the same Democrats that said it was ridiculous for Republicans to suggest that Democrats wanted to take their guns. So whereas 2 to 4 years ago, I would have said, look, this is probably a little bit hyperbolic. I don't think the Democrats are going to do that. I'm sorry. I just don't know what to believe anymore, because they've broken trust with us so many times. And because this new strain within the Democratic Party, it's not liberal. It's authoritarian. It's authoritarian. And that's the part that's so worrisome about it, is that when you see people like Delegate Lee Carter and some of the bills that they're drafting, and you see some of what we would have considered the more moderate Democrats going along with it, what you see is this streak within the Democratic Party that you will do what they tell you to do, or you will be punished for it. And so, for all of their talk about peace and coexistence and tolerance, they are the ones dropping legislation to essentially perpetuate violence against peaceful people in order to confiscate their property. And now you have some of the same people in that party talking about calling up the National Guard or getting rid of law enforcement for not doing as they're told, when they're told, how they're told. And so, no, I'm sorry, I'm more concerned than I ever have been that this authoritarian strain within the Democratic Party is getting a lot more steam and a lot more power. And it needs to be opposed, not just by Republicans, it needs to be opposed by Democrats, who don't associate with that authoritarian wing. That's what it's going to take.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, look, nationally, when they're not in power, their rally cry is resist. But in Virginia, when they are in power, their rallying cry is comply. Or else. Exactly right. Again, I think that we've learned a few things, and we can take a few things from their playbook over the past few years, and I expect we'll be putting those into effect in Virginia in the coming months. Delegate, again, thank you so much for your time today, sir. Thanks for everything you're doing, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Delegate Nick Freitas joining us here on Bearing Arms, Cam & Company. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what happened in Prince Edward County last night, where I was. First of all, again, huge crowd. The meeting was moved from the normal county supervisor's meeting room where, you could probably fit 20 or 30 people, and that's fine because normally that's all that you need. It was moved to the auditorium of the Prince Edward County High School in Farmville, Virginia, which seats around 650, and it was packed, and there were folks outside. So I'm guessing a crowd of at least 700 on hand. And what was interesting is there were two resolutions that were actually being voted on. One was a Second Amendment sanctuary resolution. The other was kind of watered down language. It urged the state legislature not to pass any unconstitutional gun control laws, but it was definitely, it didn't talk about being a Second Amendment sanctuary. It talked about protecting the Constitution, which is great, but it was watered down. And that vote failed. So Prince Edward County is an official Second Amendment sanctuary county now. The county supervisors also limited the number of speakers, or else we would have been there till 4 a.m. So originally it was going to be each side, both for one of these resolutions or against these resolutions, would speak, up to 12 speakers on each side. They ran out of opponents after 7 speakers. That was it. In a crowd of, 650, 700 people, there were 7 individuals who were willing to stand up and say, I don't want to see this, and here's why. And listen, I disagree with those folks. Kudos to them for standing up in front of a crowd of their neighbors and fellow residents and taking that contrary position. I admire them for doing that. And for the most part, they were treated with, I think, well, let me put it this way. I think 100% of the time they were treated with the respect that their arguments deserved. There were a couple of moments where the crowd got a little vocal in their response, but that came, I think, when you had speakers accuse gun owners of being afraid. That was one of the common themes of the opponents last night. You gun owners are just afraid. You're afraid of change. And because you're afraid of change and you're afraid of your changing place in this world, you cling to your guns. And it's wrong of you to do that. You need to embrace modernity. You need to embrace the progressive agenda that is coming our way. You need to embrace all of these unconstitutional gun control laws. And that didn't go over well with the crowd. That was not a winning argument. It was also, I think, not a winning argument for some of the individuals there who opposed the Second Amendment sanctuary resolution to basically accuse the crowd of being no better than the segregationists in the late 1950s and early 1960s in Virginia, who led the movement of massive resistance to integration of public schools. And that ground zero for that movement was Farmville. It was Prince Edward County. Prince Edward County actually shut down the public schools for 5 years, from 1960 to 1965, rather than integrate and allow black children and white children to go to school together. And so you had some of these opponents say, well, just like back then, you all are trying to subvert state law. You're not listening to what the law says has to be done, and you're no better than those segregationists back then. I disagree wholeheartedly. Because the massive resistance movement in Virginia in the late 50s and the 1960s was fundamentally about preventing the free exercise of a right. And by the way, the massive resistance movement in Virginia didn't start at the local level. It actually started from Virginia's Democrat governor and one of their Democrat U.S. senators, Harry Byrd. And then it spread top down to these counties. Unlike the Second Amendment movement, which is based not on depriving people of the free exercise of their rights, but securing the free exercise of their rights. And this truly is a bottom-up movement starting at the county level. And now you're seeing the reaction from people like Delegate Nick Freitas and others. But I reject wholeheartedly the idea that the mentality behind the Second Amendment sanctuary movement has anything to do with massive resistance. But that is the type of attack from gun control advocates that we will be hearing a lot of in the next couple of months, because they don't have a better argument than to call gun owners racist. They don't have a better argument than to say, well, you're promoting anarchy or chaos, even though Democrat Commonwealth attorneys in the state of Virginia are on record this year, 2019, as saying they're not going to enforce state drug law. without a peep of protest by Governor Ralph Northam, by the Attorney General Mark Herring, and others. Anyway, all right, I'm going to step off my soapbox here, and let's get to today's armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, as well as our recidivist report. We will start there. From KING, Channel 5, Seattle, Washington. You may have seen this story about a van crashing into a Ross Dress for Less in Burien, Washington. 11 people were hurt. This happened Monday evening. King County Sheriff's Office says 3 of the victims critically injured, including a 2-year-old child who was struck inside the store. It was, the store was open at the time. It was full of busy shoppers. 51-year-old Lee Skelly was behind the wheel of that van. He's been booked on charge of vehicular assault. He was also convicted, according to King 5, in the largest copper wire theft in state history back in 2010. Yeah. Deputies say that Skelly was arrested on investigation of vehicular assault, suspicion of driving while impaired by drugs. A woman in the vehicle was arrested for alleged shoplifting as well as an outstanding warrant. Tuesday, shoppers said it's a shame. It's just sad that people have to be like that. Indeed. And apparently, despite taking part in one of the largest copper wire thefts in state history, doesn't get you much time behind bars because that happened less than a decade ago, and Skelly's already back on the street and behind the wheel when he shouldn't be. On to our armed citizen story of the day. Philadelphia, PA, where a FedEx driver fatally shot a suspected armed robber in Northeast Philadelphia. Now, I got to tell you, this sounds like it's a clear-cut case of self-defense. It also sounds like the FedEx driver may be looking for a new job based on company policy. CBS in Philadelphia says a driver fatally shot a suspect Tuesday night. Happened just after 7 p.m. On Unruh Avenue in the Lawndale neighborhood of Philadelphia. 32-year-old FedEx driver just dropping off a package to a home in the area. Police say an armed gunman approached, robbed the driver. Philadelphia Police Chief Inspector Scott Small said the driver was shot once in the abdomen during the robbery. He was able to drive himself away from the scene, but he was also able to pull a gun in response and return fire to that suspect. A couple minutes after police were notified about the driver's injuries, police were called to the 1400 block of Creston Street in Philadelphia, where they found a 27-year-old man in a driveway suffering from multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, back, and torso. Suspect died at the scene. Also near that scene, investigators located a vehicle with some of the items that have been stolen from the FedEx truck. Blood and a shell casing found inside of the vehicle. FedEx told CBS 3 in Philadelphia that they are, quote, not at liberty to discuss details of our internal policies about whether or not drivers are allowed to carry. But clearly in this case, again, the driver returned fire after being shot by the armed robber. Stands to reason that this driver would have been killed by this armed robber had he not returned fire. So it is my hope, fervent hope, that whatever the internal policies of FedEx might be, that their policies do not require firing somebody who saved their own life while on the job. All right, let's get to today's good deed of the day. I would like to introduce you to Ed Higginbotham. He is 93 years old. That's Ed on the right there. And he makes toys. And boy, does Ed make toys. He's made hundreds of toys for Pennsylvania kids this year, 300 as a matter of fact, and he presented them to the Philadelphia State Police. He lives in Fayette County. He delivered the trucks to the Pennsylvania State Police troopers on Thursday of last week, just ahead of the Christmas season. Troop B of the Pennsylvania State Police ended up writing about this on social media. The toy truck's going to be handed out to preschools and other organizations around the city of Pittsburgh. Troop B sharing that photo of a trooper and Mr. Higginbotham saying a 93-year-old toy maker at it again. Well, again, that is just tremendous. He says he enjoys making toys for the kids, spends all year crafting them. He told WTAF TV, says it's just something that I enjoy doing. and now I make somebody else happy. And if that's Santa Claus, then I'm Santa Claus. Yeah, I thought Santa Claus was a jolly old fat guy with a beard. Okay, stop what you're thinking right now. Okay? White beard, I should say. Jolly old fat man with a white beard. Ed looks pretty skinny. Clean shaven at 93. But you know what? Delivering toys to the good boys and girls of the Pittsburgh area. If nothing else, I think Ed Higginbotham is certainly an honorary Santa Claus. That is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. Thank you for being a part of the program today. We'll be back with more of the day's top Second Amendment news and information on Thursday. Don't forget you can subscribe to the program at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, townhall.com's podcast page, as well as Town Hall Media at YouTube. You can also become a VIP member of Bearing Arms, get exclusive content and commentary analysis, editors' chats, and more. You can do that at bearingarms.com, and we do thank you for your support. Again, thank you for tuning in today. Enjoy the rest of your Hump Day Wednesday. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company.